But I'm going to make the case that ethics is exactly the same as the scientific method. Follows the same principles, has the same kind of justifications, has to be logical, has to be universal, has to be consistent, has to be reproducible, has to be predictive, and so on. Any valid ethical theory has to be logical and empirical. I'm going to try to make the case that ethics is not subjective. Ethics is perfectly logical. Ethics is empirical. When it comes to ethics, we do kind of have to define what they are. For me, defining them as like trying to understand right and wrong is kind of circular. It's kind of tautological. It doesn't really help that much. There definitely is, in the realm of morality, a core concept of preference. Okay, scenario number one. I'm sitting there doing my taxes, and you're just standing around whistling while I'm trying to do my taxes. And after a while, I kind of get like a facial tic, and I'm kind of like, would you mind not whistling while I'm trying to do my taxes? It's really distracting. So that's an expression of a preference, but I don't think that there's many people who would say that it's evil for somebody to be whistling while I'm doing my taxes. Right? Like, I hire some painter to paint my study, I'm going to say, I'd like you to paint it rust blood red, because it'll look good on YouTube or something. I'm stating a preference, and if he doesn't paint, if he doesn't paint it the right color, I might sort of get mad at him. I might not pay him. I'm probably not going to say that the man is, stone evil. And then there's like the have-to-haves, like don't kill, don't rape, don't steal, that kind of stuff. We're going to define morality as universally preferred human behavior. Universally preferred human behavior. Universally preferred behavior does not mean that everybody prefers that behavior. But what it means is that if you claim the behavior is preferable and you claim that it's universal, then certain consequences are going to follow. Right? Because if it's a mere opinion, I think people should not eat those Hawaiian donuts with the multicolored sprinkles on top. It's just an opinion. Doesn't mean that anyone's really going to, oh, that's interesting, I'm going to go have a donut that I want. It doesn't mean anything to anybody else. If you put forward a theory, though, that says people should behave in such and such a manner, then you are automatically accepting a whole bunch of things, and then you have a requirement, because you're trying to convince other people, you have a requirement for certain sets of logical principles and consistencies, which we'll kind of get into. The first thing that we need to figure out is, does preferred behavior is it even a valid concept? Now, when I say exist, it's, of course, it's a rather tricky question. And what we mean by that, since we do want to always work empirically, in the way that we've talked about in the podcasts on metaphysics and so on, we always want to work empirically from reality and so on. So the real question around preferred behavior is, does it exist as a principle, does it exist as actions that can be described? Does preferred behavior exist as a manifestation in the real world? How could it conceivably be opposed, the proposition that preferred behavior exists? How could it conceivably, that proposition, be opposed without using preferred behaviors? And if I say to you, preferred behavior exists, and you say to me, Steph, don't be crazy. Of course preferred behavior does not exist. In no way, shape, or form does preferred behavior exist. Okay. So, what you're telling me is that you would prefer that I not believe that preferred behavior exists. If you argue against preferred behavior, the existence and manifestation of preferred behavior, you are manifesting preferred behavior. There's no way to escape the self-contradictory nature of that position. Even if you just stare at me, then you're still preferring not to answer. If you say to me, Steph, preferred behavior exists, and I say, no way does preferred behavior exist, then of course I'm choosing to jab my finger at you, I'm choosing to use English, I'm choosing to be emphatic, I'm choosing to disagree with you, I'm preferring all of these things. Now, if preferred behavior exists, how are we going to understand it? How are we going to make sense of it? How are we going to organize it in a way that is not subjective or whim-based or this or that or the other? It's a very, very important question. If you accept the definition that morality is universally preferred behavior, i.e., it's put forward as the proposition that this is what everyone should do, and so the question then becomes, does universally preferred behavior exist? Well, obviously there are some that are universally preferred, and it doesn't mean universally obeyed. It just means universally preferred, right? In that most human beings will seek to avoid pain and pursue pleasure. We know that there are biologically ingrained, not just in human beings, but in all organisms, certain preferred behaviors. Human beings have ingrained within our natures preferred behaviors, even if we just look at the basic pain and pleasure principle and so on. The next question is, if preferred behavior exists, to what degree does preferred behavior exist? If I'm saying that there's a right and a wrong, that there's universally preferred behavior for mankind, the moment I start to use the word universal, then I'm kind of bound by the laws of logic and the scientific method and observation and reproducibility, experimentation, and so on. It has to be independent of time, it has to be independent of place, it has to be reproducible. I can't logically say, okay, Tom should not kill, but Jerry should kill. Because then what I'm doing is saying I have two opposing laws for human beings. In other words, I have contradictory principles applying to the same entities. I'm not deriving the consistency that is required from the objects that I'm describing. Let's take a look at something like people have property rights. People have property rights. Well, what is property right? The property right is the right to use and dispose of matter, fundamentally an object, or it could be an idea, I guess, but the ability, the moral legitimate right, the ability to use an object. Now, if I say that people don't have property rights, then anybody who uses matter in any way, shape, or form is acting in violation of that moral rule. You have exercised property rights in order to survive. You are exercising the property rights over your own body in order to communicate about property rights. Therefore, anybody who says property rights don't exist doesn't really make a whole lot of sense again. Now, if you put forward a proposition that says, thou shalt steal, thou shalt steal, that stealing is a morally good thing, thou shalt steal. Well, what that means, of course, is that people who are not currently in the act of stealing something are immoral. But if you say thou shalt not steal, then the only people who are actually immoral are those currently in the act of stealing from something. If you're going to put forward a proposition that says thou shalt steal, so obviously that leads you to some very ridiculous things. People who are asleep are evil. The problem with thou shalt steal, of course, is that it is both a simultaneous an affirmation and a denial of property rights. The main sort of thing that I want to get across here is that when you put forward a proposition about universally preferred behavior, you can't just randomly slice human beings up into, oh well, these are the politicians, or these are the soldiers, or these are the cops, or right? If there are moral rules, then there are moral rules consistently for everyone. Universally preferred behavior seems to be pretty consistent across humankind. The need for logic, the possibility of objectivity and rationality within the science of universally preferred behavior that we call ethics, the fact that people disagree, the fact that there are gray areas, lots of contention, and so on, all it means is that people aren't being rational. Then we can look at the question of, is there generally better universally preferred behavior? In other words, is there behavior that people should choose over other forms of behavior? And what we can do in that, in those circumstances, we'll start to get into now. And I'm going to lean rather heavily on the analogy of nutrition, or to some degree medicine, to sort of help make the case for a universal system of ethics, and we will also run a few common ethical questions through our ethics machine, so to speak, and see if we can't come up with some rational ideas or rational things that sort of make sense at a gut level. Let's have a look at this question of, are there behaviors that should be universally preferred by people or not? When you find a logical inconsistency, a self-contradiction, a premise which contradicts another premise, an axiom that is not universally valid, the moment you come across that, you can stop. So, if we're going to talk about universally preferred behavior in any way, shape, or form, then either it exists or it doesn't. So let's take a look at the premise that universally preferred behavior does not exist. There's no such thing as universally preferred behavior. We can generally say that if an organism has a goal called survival, that eating and drinking and sleeping would probably be pretty high on that list, right? You can't put forward a truth value statement that says universally preferred behavior does not exist. It's exactly the same as we talked about before when we talk about I'm going to use your hearing to convince you that the senses are invalid. I mean, that's a complete logical contradiction. We actually we can stop right there and dismiss it. We can go on a little further if we like. But basically, if I say that universally preferred behavior does not exist, then I'm putting forward the proposition that it is universally preferable that people believe that universally preferred behavior does not exist. This is a complete self-contradiction. If universally preferred behavior does not exist, then everybody should be able to do whatever it is that they want to do. Universally preferred behavior does not exist, so everybody can do whatever they want to do. Well, that's fine. Now, let's suppose that we accept that as a premise. What happens then if I wish to become the dictator of the world? What happens when one person's preferred behavior interferes with another person's preferred behavior? So, let's say that you prefer to be free, and I prefer that you be my slave. Right? So we have contradictory preferred behavior here. What are you going to do as a moral philosopher to resolve this problem? Because if everybody just wants to go live in the woods and do their thing, independently of everyone else, then you have a fairly decent, I think, argument, or at least consistent argument with the proposition that universally preferred behavior doesn't exist. If there's no such thing as universally preferred behavior, then for one person to impose preferred behavior on another is wrong. Because there's no such thing as universally preferred behavior. And so you have a problem, a logical contradiction, even if we accept the base premise that universally preferred behavior does not exist. We then end up with the contradiction that if universally preferred behavior does not exist, it is universally preferable that human beings not impose their values on others, because that would be a violation of the subjectivity of preferred behavior. The question is only, what can be considered universally preferred behavior? Now we have a sort of twofold task, and we'll obviously divide this into two podcasts. The first fold task is, let's put forward some propositions and see if they conform to universally preferred behavior. And secondly, let's say that we come up with a set of universally preferred behaviors. Then what we need to do is we need to compare our theory against testable reality to find out if the theory holds true. Let's put forward a proposition that says murder is wrong. So, if I say that murder is wrong, can I universalize it? Yeah. Thou shalt not steal is universal, right? We can universalize that very easily. Because if you say, whatever morality you come up with, right? If you say, theft is good because you should take whatever you want, because you should satisfy your own desires, right? Theft is good because if I see something in a shop window that I want, I should just grab it, I should satisfy my desires, I should act to maximize my pleasure. That would be sort of the principle behind it, or sort of one possible principle behind it. Well, I can certainly make that case, but the problem that I'm going to have in terms of universality is it's going to be rather tricky for me to say that all human beings should satisfy the desires that give them the most pleasure, should maximize their pleasure, and so on, and therefore that justifies stealing or rape or murder or whatever, because of course it's not universal. If I see something in a shop window and I want to maximize my pleasure, and maximizing my pleasure is the greatest goal, then the problem that I'm going to face in justifying that is that by stealing, I am maximizing my pleasure, but the person who I'm stealing from is having his pleasure automatically diminished, right? So I can't just make up a rule for myself, right? Because we're talking about universals here, which means it has to apply to all human beings at all times, under all circumstances, again, minor exceptions. So if I have a theory which says hedonism is the thing, you just go out there, man, and you just satisfy your own wants and desires, and maximizing your own pleasure is the primary goal of life, then it's not universal. Because whatever you do to maximize your own pleasure that diminishes somebody else's pleasure would automatically contradict the moral theory. Hi there, it's Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain Radio. I hope that you're doing well, and I also hope that you're not just listening to the audio cast of this, because we have some visual cues, some not quite special effects, but some visual cues to go over the introduction of some facts into our debate. I know, it's a little bit of a shock. Just breathe, and we'll get through this together. I know that we've been talking a lot about theory, but I hope to be able to show some empirical evidence for the kinds of theories that we've been talking about over the past few podcasts, with particular attention to property rights. Now, as you remember, we talked about if you want to put forward a moral theory, then that moral theory has to be logical, rational, empirical, universal, testable, reproducible, independent of time and place, and so on, just as any scientific theory or biological theory and so on would have to be. So what I'd like to do now is talk about ways that we could empirically verify or validate certain theories, particularly those with regards to property rights. And there's lots of theories which I've talked about in my podcasts about why property rights are valid, basically based on the foundation that you own your body, therefore you own the effects of your body, therefore you have moral responsibility, and if you create something or transform it from a non-usable product to a usable product, so if you catch a fish in the sea, then turn it into a dinner, then you have created a product as surely as if you had invented it out of thin air, since it was useless swimming in the bottom of the ocean. And so there's lots of ways to verify and justify the foundation of property rights, from the sort of Lockean view of the infusion of labor or enclosures to the view of self-ownership and therefore owning the effects of one's body and so on. But let's just say that we accept the universal validity of property rights as simply based on the axiom, which I think is actually enough, of saying that either human beings have property rights or they don't have property rights. You can't have human beings who have property rights and then have human beings who do not have property rights, or at least you can't argue for a true or logically consistent, which is really the same thing. You can't argue for a true and logically consistent moral proposition, which says some people have property rights, other people don't have property rights, because what is going to be proposed for a human being must be proposed for all human beings. Let's say that the theory that we're at least going to put to the test would be that property rights are valid for all human beings. Now, if it's true that property rights are valid for all human beings, then there should be some test for that. But we do really want to have a look for some empirical evidence. Now, we're going to make some assumptions here, and we're going to say that violence is bad, that prosperity is good, that living is better than dying, then having your children live is better than having your children die, and things like that. I hope that I don't have to go into a whole lot of explanations. There are logical explanations for all of these positions, but if we say that something like the non-aggression principle, which is thou shalt not initiate force against your fellow man, is a universal, valid, and positive moral obligation, or you could even say that it's a negative in that it's a thou shalt not, then we can see some specific and measurable results. What do human beings do when they're not being aggressed against in a violent manner? The results, we can sort of see very strongly the results of this kind of stuff. So let's have a look. I'm going to sort of hold up another chart here. Ooh, look at that. The gripping graphics. It's almost like you're watching CNN, isn't it? Now what you see here, going from left to right, we're starting at 12
100 AD, and so just at the beginning of the Middle Ages, and we're going to 2000 AD, and this is real wages. This is for building workers, although it's common for most. This is real wages, so this is money adjusted for inflation and all that kind of stuff, purchasing power. And you can see, sort of chugging along the Middle Ages, nothing's going on. You're getting sort of $100 or 100 units, and then starting around the sort of mid-18th century, mid-19th century, you begin to see this massive climb. And of course, this is the result of what happens when you actually begin to respect the reality of people's property rights. Right? This is unprecedented in history. This particular graph is why we have the incredible society that we have now, with all of the innovations and all of the economic growths and so on. Now, let's have a look at gross domestic product per person in pre-industrial England. This is up to 1950, and the only one I could find of this is versus India. And here, of course, this is 1250 to actually to the year 2000, and we've gone off the chart here. But here you can see we're chugging along. When you begin to respect property rights, then the gross domestic product per person begins to go up enormously. Again, there's another example of how all of this stuff can work. If you want to look at a fairly, this is somewhat subjective, but here's an example of male height, right? So this is some indication of health. Male height in Europe and Asia, 0 AD to the year 2000. And you can see here, we're going from 0 AD to the year 2000, and I'm going to sort of zoom in on the right-hand side here. You can see this enormous growth in the height of men during and after the Industrial Revolution, starting at around 1800, because, of course, they were actually getting enough food to eat so they could grow to a relatively decent height. Now, there's lots of theories about the growth of the Industrial Revolution, but certainly the one factor that is different from all preceding societies is the recognition of property rights the increased recognition of property rights. So here's another example, 1660 to 1851. These are the number of patents filed by year. 1660 was the year that the patent system in England first began. So here, this is from 1660 to 1851. You can see what happens in the late 18th century. Heaven. This is a wonderful thing, this automatic light adjustment. So here, from left to right, we have, on the left-hand side, we have, trundle, very few patents. And then I'm sort of zoom in here. When we start to get into the late 18th century, when we begin to have the recognition and expansion of property rights in land, labor, capital, and so on, you begin to see an enormous increase in the amount of patents that are being created. Is that the basic principle of economics is that people respond to incentives. If I'm allowed to keep the products of what it is that I earn and make, then I'm going to have a greater incentive to do that. And if I don't get to keep the products of what I earn and create, then I'm not really going to do that. So let's have a look at British gross domestic product normalized. So in 1860 is 100. So this is British gross domestic product over the very long run. Oops, let me just center that. And so here you can see we're trundling along from the year 1200 on the left-hand side of your screen. And then we begin to get the Industrial Revolution in the late 17th century. And here you can see, of course, this massive increase, so that we have this enormous increase in to 1900. I mean, this isn't even counting the sort of 20th century. So there's an example of what happens to gross domestic product when you recognize the property rights. When we have a look at productivity, so this is economic efficiency, and there's lots of factors that go into this, but let's just have a quick look at this. Here is the productivity levels in cotton cloth production. Cotton was hugely fought over in terms of import duties and tariffs, and they were largely broken down. And so here, this is from 1760 to 1880. 1760 to 1880. So this is just sort of during the actual sort of considered to be the major years of the Industrial Revolution. It's sort of estimated that one particular process went down from 32 days to less than a day. Again, this is all about the recognition of ethical theories. Is it measurable? Is it testable? Here we have the growth in world population from 10,000 BC to the year 2000, and of course there will be many people who are appalled at this as being an example of how we're destroying the planet and blah blah blah, but funnily enough I'm quite happy to be in the 5.5 million people who were alive in the year, a billion people who were alive in the year 2000. But you can see real gross domestic product per person in England from the 1260s to the 1990s. So this has the whole deal included. So on the left-hand side you have the early Middle Ages, the 1260s. On the right-hand side you have you to understand that we're not just philosophizing in a vacuum here. We really are trying to find some particularly strong evidence for what it is that we're talking about, because we don't want to claim that the scientific method and empirical verification is very important for our theories and then reject those in the moral realm.